She couldn't run, she couldn't fight, and the most dangerous man in the city had a gun pointed at the person she was trying to protect. Most people would have frozen. Lena threw herself to the floor instead, broken leg and all, and whispered the three words that changed everything. What happened next? Nobody saw coming, not even him. Welcome to a channel where crime bosses have hearts. Families break and heal, and love shows up in the darkest, most unexpected places. This story will remind you that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up when everything in you says stay down. If that hits close to home, hit like, drop your city in the comments, and subscribe, because Lena's story is just getting started, and you do not want to miss what comes next.
The fluorescent tubes in Sal's diner had been on the fritz for 3 weeks. The owner promised a fix, but he was a single, tired man struggling to keep the lights on at all, so they buzzed and flickered, casting the night in a sickly yellow glow. Lena Hayes no longer saw it. She moved through her shift with a practiced limp, her left leg dragging slightly, a stutter in her step that regulars ignored and new customers always noticed. A drunk driver had shattered the leg 4 years ago at Madison and 7th. It took 3 surgeries, 14 pins, and left her with chronic pain that flared up with the weather or after too long on her feet, which was every day. "Ketchup for table 9, Marcus yelled from the grill, his hands expertly flipping burgers. He'd been at Sal's for 15 years, and the exhaustion showed in the lines around his eyes. And Sal's hiding in the office again. Lena's grip tightened on the coffee pot. How long? An hour and a half. That was never good. A locked office meant calls Sal didn't want overheard, calls that left his hands shaking. "Any idea what it's about?" she asked quietly. Marcus's look was a mix of pity and fear. "Money. It's always money." The dinner crowd, a sparse 11 people, had dwindled to the usual late-night lingerers. Old Joe was doctoring his coffee at the counter. A trucker named Dale worked his way through a slice of pie in booth 7. And Emma, the new girl, wiped down tables with the frantic pace of someone who needed every single cent on her paycheck. Emma was 19. She reminded Lena of a younger self, before the accident and the debt, before she learned the world doesn't wait for you to heal. "You doing okay?" Emma asked, her young face etched with worry. "Fine, just worn out." "You're always worn out," Emma said, scrubbing at an imaginary spot. "When did you last take a day for yourself?" "Can't afford it." "But your limp is worse tonight. Maybe just sit for a bit." The front door swung open. 3 men stepped inside, and an immediate chill filled the room. Their suits cost more than Lena earned in 6 months, perfectly tailored wool in charcoal and midnight blue. But it wasn't their clothing that made Lena's stomach knot. It was their movement. They were predators sizing up their prey, commanding the space they occupied. The man in the lead was in his early 30s, with a face that could have been on a magazine cover, sharp cheekbones, cold blue eyes, and perfect dark hair. He looked around Sal's diner, as if inspecting something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "We're here for Sal." It was not a question, but a declaration, delivered in a voice as smooth and potent as aged bourbon. Marcus froze mid-flip. Emma went white, the rag in her hand trembling. Old Joe suddenly found his coffee fascinating. Lena spoke up. "He's in a meeting. Can I?" "You can get him." The man's smile was a razor's edge. "Now would be good." "I'll go," Emma whispered, starting for the back. "No." Lena grabbed her wrist, a powerful instinct telling her to keep this girl far from these men. "I've got it." She limped toward the office, painfully aware of 3 sets of eyes fixed on her unsteady gait. Each step felt like an admission of weakness. The office door was flimsy. She could hear Sal's strained voice. "I get it. I know I'm late. I just need another week. I promise I can get it. I just—" Lena knocked gently. "Sal?" A sudden silence, then a frantic shuffling. The door opened a crack, revealing Sal's gray, sweaty face, looking a decade older than he had that morning. "There are some men out here," Lena said softly. "They're asking for you." He shut his eyes as if bracing for a blow. "Tell them 5 minutes, please." "Sal, what is this?" "Just 5 minutes, Lena, please." She went back to the main room. The men had fanned out. One blocked the exit, another stood at the counter, sealing off the kitchen. Their leader was planted in the middle of the floor. Emma was hiding behind the register, her knuckles stark white. "He needs 5 minutes," Lena stated. "He's had 3 months." The leader glanced at his watch, a Rolex naturally. "Time's up." "Look, I have no idea what this is, but—" "No," he cut her off cleanly. "You don't. So I suggest you return to serving coffee and let the adults talk." A flash of heat went through Lena's chest. For 24 years she'd been dismissed because of her leg, her job, her station in life. She usually just took it. But this man, his casual cruelty, and the way his eyes lingered on Emma, stirred a reckless fire in her. "This is a family diner," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "Not whatever kind of place you're used to. So you can either order or you can leave." The silence that fell was heavy and complete. The man turned his head, observing her like a curious biologist studying a strange bug. "What's your name?" "Lena." "Lena," he repeated, the word slowly. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "Should I?" One of his men by the door let out a sound that was half laugh, half warning. "My name," the leader said, articulating every syllable, "is Victor Kane." The name landed like a physical impact. Even Lena, who kept her world small and her head down, knew it. Victor Kane, the well-dressed ghost who ran half the city's illegal dealings. The man officials denied knowing, and criminals were terrified to cross. The reason people checked their locks at night. And she had just told him to order a coffee or get out. "I see you've heard of me." Victor's smile was all sharp points. "Good. Let's not waste time. Here's how this will go, Lena. Sal will walk out of that office in 60 seconds. He will give me the $50,000 he owes, plus 3 months of interest. Then my associates and I will depart, and you will all continue your evening. Neat, tidy, no one gets hurt." $50,000. The figure was staggering. Lena had about $700 saved after 2 years of scrimping. "And if he doesn't have it?" Her voice held steadier than she felt. "Then," Victor said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the forecast, "things get complicated, and no one wants that." The office door creaked open. Sal stumbled out, looking 20 years older. His shirt was soaked, his hands shaking as he leaned on the doorframe. "Mr. Kane," his voice was a ragged whisper. I know I'm late. I should have had it. I just need more time. 2 more weeks, I swear." "You needed 3 months, Sal. I gave you 3 months. Business has been slow. Equipment failures. The walk-in freezer died. The health department. Not my problem." Victor's voice remained level, which was more terrifying than a shout. "Do you have any idea how many people in this city owe me money, Sal? What do you think happens if I just let every business owner pay me whenever they feel like it?" "Please," Sal begged, and Lena couldn't look away. "I have some. Not all of it. I've got 30,000 in the safe. It's over half. If you could just give me 2 weeks for the balance." 2 weeks becomes 2 months. 2 months becomes never. Victor's eyes were like chips of ice. "Do I look like I'm running a charity? Do you think I got where I am by being sentimental?" "I'll get it. I swear on my life I'll get every cent." "Your life." Victor considered it, tilting his head. "An interesting offer." He moved then, fluid and quick, and a pistol was suddenly in his hand, not pointed, just present. An undeniable weight of steel and threat. Emma let out a small, strangled gasp. "Here's my counteroffer," Victor said, his tone conversational despite the gun. "You give me the 30,000 now, And to cover the difference, his gaze roamed the diner, settling on Emma. I'll take. The door chimed with an absurd cheerfulness as it closed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt heavy. Marcus was the first to break the stillness, rushing to Lena's side and helping her to her feet with gentle hands. Are you okay? Did he hurt you? Lena leaned on the counter, the familiar throb in her leg a dull echo of the night's terror. I'm fine, she managed, though the lie tasted like ash. Across the diner, Sal sank into a booth, his eyes glued to the open safe as if it held a ghost. Emma, her face streaked with tears, threw her arms around Lena's neck, her sobs muffled against her shoulder. You saved me, she whispered, over and over. You saved my life. Lena just shook her head. I didn't do anything. You stood up to him, Emma insisted, pulling back to look at her. Nobody stands up to Victor Kane. Nobody. But she had, and against all odds, she was still standing. Just moments before, that same silence had been filled with the rustle of cash. Victor Kane, his expression a cold mask, had turned from Lena on the floor to a stunned Sal. The safe, open it. As Sal fumbled with the lock, one of Victor's men entered, setting a leather briefcase on the counter. Inside lay more money than Lena had ever imagined. Count out 50,000, Victor commanded, his voice cutting through the disbelief. Stack after crisp stack of $100 bills landed in the old safe. When it was done, Victor's gaze found Sal again. Your debt is paid, in full. The interest, too. Then his eyes flickered to Lena, still crumpled on the grimy floor. Consider it a gift, he said, his voice void of warmth. From the girl who can't run, but stood anyway. She was looking up at him from the cold linoleum, every ounce of pride stripped away. Her leg had given out, the old injury screaming in protest, leaving her at his feet. Please. The word was a raw scrape in her throat, empty of everything but desperation. I can't run. I can't fight, but don't take her. She told him about Emma, about her being just 19, about the little brother who relied on her, about her dreams of community college. His face was unreadable until he asked a question that shattered the tension. What happened to your leg? Surprised, she told him about the car accident 4 years ago. Why didn't you just stay quiet? He pressed, crouching to her level. Why risk it? Lena's voice cracked. Because she's 19, because she reminds me of who I used to be, and because nobody helped me when I needed it. Courage felt a lot like terror. Lena had planted herself between Victor and Emma, her arms spread wide. Touch her, she'd said, her voice trembling, and you'll have to go through me first. For a few heart-stopping seconds, he just stared. Then came a terrible laugh, laced with dark amusement. He'd holstered his weapon slowly, stepping closer until she could smell his expensive cologne. You can barely stand, he'd murmured, his eyes cataloging her shaking legs, her sheer terror. What exactly do you think you're going to do? She held his gaze. Whatever it takes. His hand shot out, not with bruising force, but with the chilling confidence of absolute power. He grabbed her arm and pulled. As he knew it would, her damaged leg buckled instantly, sending her crashing to the floor. The world had frozen the moment Victor's gaze landed on Emma. I'll take her, he'd stated, his tone as casual as if he were choosing a piece of merchandise. She's an asset. Young, pretty, obviously needs the money. The words were a gut punch. No. The protest tore from Lena's throat before she could think. No, you can't. She's just a kid. It was that single, cold-blooded assessment of a young girl's life that had propelled her forward. She hadn't made a choice. A choice had been made for her. In that instant, she forgot the pain in her leg, her own fear, and the impossible odds. All she knew was that she couldn't let it happen. Not again. The night had started like any other. The fluorescent lights of the diner hummed a familiar tune as Lena moved between tables, the ache in her leg a constant companion. She refilled coffee for Marcus, who always sat in the same booth, and shared a quiet word with Emma, the 19-year-old who worked tirelessly, her dreams so much bigger than this small town. Sal, the owner, had been quiet all evening, a deep worry etched into the lines on his face. It was just another shift, a world away from crime bosses and life-altering decisions. Just a waitress with a bad leg, a young girl with a future, and a boss with a secret debt, all of them completely unaware that a man named Victor Kane was about to walk through the door. With an effortless grace she hadn't possessed in years, Lena entered the restaurant. The faint clicking of her heels on the marble floor was a sound of victory. She moved without a limp, without a flicker of pain, weaving through tables adorned with fresh flowers and bathed in soft amber light. This weekly dinner with Victor Kane was no longer a terrifying obligation but a quiet ritual, a conversation between two people who now understood each other through honesty. This reality, walking freely, living without the constant ache, without the pitying glances, was a life she'd thought was lost forever. It was a gift, freely given, just as his man James had promised. Mr. Kane, she now knew, never forced anyone into something they didn't truly want. He simply opened doors others couldn't see. But getting here had been a trial by fire. It started in a gleaming medical center high above the city, a place of polished steel and glass that felt like another world. There, a kind-eyed surgeon named Sarah Chen, with graying hair and a practical bun, laid out the brutal path ahead. She spoke of 3 separate surgeries spread over 18 grueling months, of pins being reset and scarred tissue meticulously removed. Dr. Chen detailed the extensive, agonizing physical therapy that would follow each procedure, warning that recovery would be immensely difficult. She had been honest about the pain, but also about the prize. A 90 to 95% return to full function. A life restored, not just stabilized. And as Lena later learned, every step of that torturous, expensive journey was overseen by Mr. Kane's organization, ensuring she had everything she needed. The price for this miracle had seemed both immense and strangely simple: dinner once a week. Lena remembered asking Victor Kane directly during their first tense meeting, "Why me?" His answer had surprised her. He valued honesty, directness, and he saw a strength in her that she had forgotten she possessed. His only condition was that she speak her mind, that she not treat him as a benefactor but as a person. That arrangement, which had once felt like a trap, was merely a request for conversation. Dr. Chen had hinted at it, mentioning that Mr. Kane had funded treatments for others before, never asking for anything inappropriate. As a mandatory reporter, she'd said, her silence should speak volumes. She was right. The exchange was never about servitude, it was about connection. Yet the night she made the choice was the longest of her life. The surgeon's words echoed in her mind. A 6, maybe 7-figure cost, all covered. All for a few hours of her time each week. It was a mad, dangerous bargain. Lying in her tiny apartment, her leg throbbing a familiar, miserable rhythm against the cheap painkillers, Lena wrestled with the impossible proposition. Was a normal life worth dining with the city's most feared man? At 2 a.m., overwhelmed by pain and a flicker of hope, she dialed the number. A calm, professional receptionist answered immediately, utterly unfazed by the late hour. "Dr. Chen's office," she'd said warmly. "We have you scheduled for 10 a.m. Mr. Kane was quite confident you would call." And in that moment, Lena knew she had already agreed. It all began on a day that felt like any other. A man in an expensive suit named James had appeared in her life, his presence a stark contrast to her fading world of minimum wage work and constant physical pain. He stood with a practiced confidence and laid out the offer not as a demand, but as a consideration. He spoke of a chance to change her life, to walk without a limp, to end the nightly agony, to stop wondering how many years her leg had left. "All Mr. Kane is asking for," he'd said, his voice calm and even, "is a few hours of your time." Then, leaving a small white card on her table, the key to Dr. Sarah Chen, to a future without pain, he simply walked out, leaving the decision and her destiny entirely in her hands. Floors. They moved past tables of people who breathed this rarefied air. Men in suits tailored so perfectly they seemed part of them, women draped in jewels that scattered light with every turn of a head. Lena was a ghost. No one even glanced her way. The hostess guided her to a secluded room, its entrance marked by a massive wooden door. With a single knock, she opened it and gestured for Lena to go inside. Victor Kane rose as she entered. He was a different man from the one she'd seen at the diner. The predator was gone, replaced by someone who'd set aside his armor. The suit jacket was off, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, showing powerful forearms and the edge of a tattoo on his wrist. The weapon was surely still on him, but he almost seemed normal. Almost. Lena. He gestured to the open seat. Thanks for coming. She sat down, her leg throbbing a complaint. Did I really have an option? You always have an option. He settled back into his chair with an effortless grace that spoke of total self-possession. You could have refused, stayed home, and I would have honored that. His gaze met hers, and she was again struck by his unnerving control. I am many things, Lena, but a liar isn't one of them. When I give my word, I keep it. A waiter materialized, poured wine into 2 glasses, and vanished before she could object. I don't drink, she stated. Then don't. Victor lifted his glass, but didn't take a sip. You seemed like you needed a place to put your hands. He wasn't wrong. Her knuckles were white from gripping the table's edge. You have questions, Victor stated. It wasn't an inquiry. Let's hear them. Why this? The debt cleared, the operation, all of it. What do you want from me? I told you, dinner once a week. People don't pay a small fortune for conversation. I do. He set his glass down, leaning in. Do you have any idea what my life is, Lena? My every day is filled with people who want something. My money, my protection, my influence. They lie to my face and assume I'm blind to it. They smile while plotting to stick a knife in my back. They feed me words they think I want to hear. He paused. Then I met you. What about me? You put yourself between me and a girl you barely knew. There was no scheme, no angle, no thought of personal gain. You just did it because you thought it was the right thing to do. His voice had softened. Do you know how rare that is in my circle? That wasn't courage, Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. It was desperation. Perhaps, but it was authentic. Victor's stare was so intense, she had to fight the urge to look away. And I haven't encountered anything authentic in a very long time. The waiter brought appetizers, tiny, perfect creations Lena couldn't name. They were like miniature paintings on a plate. So what? She asked, looking at the food. I'm just your weekly shot of reality, a dose of sincerity? Something like that. Victor picked up a fork. I live my life making choices that impact thousands. Decisions that mean I have to be 10 steps ahead, see every possibility, and trust no one. It's draining. Then I find someone who doesn't operate that way, who leads with her heart instead of a calculator. He stopped. I find that compelling. And I find you terrifying. Good. His smile was razor sharp. You ought to be. I am a terrifying man, but I'm also giving you the truth, which is more than you get from most people you know. You know nothing about me. I know more than you realize. Victor finally ate a bite. I know you've been at Sal's for 3 years. I know you wire money to your aunt in Pennsylvania monthly, stretching yourself thin to do it. I know you take Emma's shifts when she needs off for her brother's medical visits. I know you've been in constant pain for 4 years and haven't uttered a word of complaint. A cold dread washed over Lena. You've been spying on me. I've been learning about you. There's a distinction. That doesn't make it better. Maybe not, but it's honest. He put his fork down. I never make an investment without doing my research, Lena. And this is an investment. In what? In a person who might just give me a straight answer. They ate quietly for a minute. The food was likely spectacular, but Lena couldn't taste a thing. She was trying to figure out Victor Kane, the man who ruined lives over the phone but paid for a stranger's surgery, who commanded a feared empire but seemed to genuinely want to talk to a waitress. It just didn't add up. My turn to ask, Lena said, breaking the silence. How does someone become this? Running a shadow empire, owning the city. You don't just wake up one morning and choose to be a crime lord. Victor was silent for a while, his face a mask. My father spent 30 years in a factory, 60 hours a week, building parts for cars he could never own. When I was 15, the company moved the plant overseas for cheaper labor. They gave my dad 2 weeks' pay and a pat on the back. He swirled the wine in his glass. 6 months later, he was dead. Heart attack from the stress, since we had no insurance. I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be. It was an education. Victor's voice was flat, empty. The world doesn't pay you for hard work. It pays you for having power. So I decided I'd get power by harming people. By safeguarding my own interests and those of my people. He met her gaze. You stepped between me and Emma, putting yourself in harm's way. Was that wrong? That's different, isn't it? We both risk things to protect what's important. The scale might differ, but the idea is the same. Lena wanted to disagree, but his logic was disturbingly solid. You're trying to justify being violent. I'm describing how things are. Victor leaned back. In your world, morality is simple. Good and evil, clear lines. In my world, it's all gray. Every move has a price. Every choice is a sacrifice. The ones who say otherwise are either fools or liars. So you just live with it? The fear, the violence, everything. She woke to a world made of gauze and soft light, certain the man sitting in the chair beside her was a phantom conjured by the painkillers. But the hallucination didn't fade. Victor was still there in his impeccable suit, a stark figure in the sterile white room. You came, she breathed, the words thick on her tongue. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I implied I would. He leaned forward slightly. How do you feel? Like my leg was taken apart and pieced back together wrong. He nodded. That's a fair assessment. But Dr. Chen says it was flawless. Even better than she hoped. Lena tried to shift, a mistake that sent a sharp warning up her nerves. Victor was on his feet in an instant, his hands surprisingly gentle as he adjusted her pillows. Easy, he murmured. You just went through something major. Before the haze pulled her under again, her mind drifted back to the night he'd promised her this chance. Are you nervous? He'd asked over a glass of wine she didn't touch, just days before the surgery. Terrified, Lena had confessed. What if it's all for nothing? All this pain, and I end up right back where I started. His certainty was unnerving. Then we do it again until it works. Dr. Chen is the finest there is. If she can't fix it, we'll find someone who can. That was how his world worked, she realized. Every problem had a price, and it all led back to the moment that haunted her. She had asked him why it mattered so much, and he'd been quiet for a long time. Because, he said finally, when you fell at my feet and told me you couldn't run, I saw something in your eyes. It wasn't fear. It was just the truth. It has stayed with me ever since. That strange reason was why her friend Emma had hugged her so tightly it hurt, tears streaming down her face, saying, "This is because you saved me." And it was all because of the strangest trade ever proposed. "You're covering my surgery, my rent, and my lost wages," she'd said, the scale of it finally dawning on her that first night. That's an unbelievable amount of money. Yes, he'd agreed, his expression impossible to read. More than I should spend on a stranger, but I have more money than I could use in 10 lifetimes, and you have something I can't buy. Think of it as a fair exchange. What could I possibly have that you can't buy? He'd said the word like a confession. Authenticity, the courage to do the right thing when it costs you everything. At the end of the night, He'd handed her a card with a single number. My direct line. Call if you need anything at all. The driver who took her home had said it best. Miss Hayes, Mr. Kane doesn't do things like this. For anyone. You must be someone special. She didn't feel special, just stunned into silence. It had all started when he'd asked, his voice unexpectedly soft. Tell me about the accident. Lena had tensed. Why? Because I want to understand, he'd said, his gaze direct. Because it's a part of you, and I'm trying to learn who you are. So the words came, spilling the story she rarely told. How she was 20, juggling 2 jobs to save for nursing school. The exhausting drive home at 3 in the morning from a warehouse shift. Then the blinding headlights at Madison and 7th as a drunk driver blew through a red light. She remembered waking in a hospital 3 days later, her mother's weeping the first sound she heard, as a doctor explained they'd saved her leg, but her walk would never be the same. The medical bills devoured everything, her savings, her mother's, money from family they could never repay. And so, her life for the last 4 years had been a diner and a permanent limp. That's not fair, he had said quietly, and she looked at him and replied, No, it's not. But you already knew life isn't fair, didn't you? That was why he'd done it. Why he had waved away the debt she was there to pay. That was a negotiation tactic, Victor admitted, almost embarrassed, referring to his threat against the 19-year-old girl. Cruel and unnecessary, which is why I settled the debt myself. His voice had hardened then. Do you know what happens when men like me don't exist? Chaos. Worse people fill the void. He paused, his gaze intense. But you collapsed. Because you showed me something I'd forgotten. Courage without an angle. Sacrifice for no reward. He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly human. It reminded me that not everyone is playing my game. And in that moment, the entire puzzle clicked together. Her desperate offer, the limp that kept her from running, and the raw honesty that had pierced right through his world. The operation. Why are you even here? Because you were alone. Because no one should wake up from something like this with no one there. He sat back down, and for the first time, Lena saw the exhaustion etched on his face. And because I needed to know you were all right. You have a criminal enterprise to manage. The enterprise can manage itself for a few hours. A fog from the medicine was pulling her under again, her eyelids getting heavy. Rest, Victor's voice was a low murmur. I'll be here when you open your eyes. And he was. Every time she surfaced over the next 12 hours, he was there, reading his phone, taking quiet calls, once hissing in hushed tones at someone about a situation that demanded his attention. But he never left. By day 2, with the fog lifted, Lena finally voiced the question that had been burning inside her. What do you really want from me, Victor? He looked up, his gaze direct. This, she said, motioning to the room, to him. No one does all this for dinner conversation. What's the real price? Victor was silent for a long moment, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. I want to remember what it's like to be human, he said at last. I want to face someone who isn't afraid of me, who doesn't want my money or my power, who just speaks to me like a man, not a monster. He paused. Is that so difficult to accept? Yes, Lena replied truthfully. Because you are a monster. You destroy people for a living. And that's when the memory hit her, explaining everything. The diner. A terrified young waitress named Emma. Victor. A storm of quiet fury. And Lena, without thinking, stepping between them, taking the blow that was never meant for her. It was a single, desperate act that had started it all. The footsteps that echoed in the alley were unhurried, confident. Victor walked into the dim light not as a victim entering a trap, but as a predator claiming his territory. The 20 minutes that had felt like an eternity for Lena ended in a blur of violence she could barely comprehend. There was no fear in his eyes, only a cold, precise focus that was far more terrifying. He wasn't the benefactor who visited her in the hospital. He was someone else entirely. When the alley fell silent again, he knelt and cut the zip ties from her raw wrists. The immediate threat was gone, replaced by a chilling new understanding of the man who had just saved her. He had kept her safe, but that desperate, forced phone call now hung between them, the first piece of a puzzle she was only beginning to see. That call was the price of her life. She'd stumbled out of work, only to be grabbed and dragged into the shadows. Blinding, white-hot pain exploded in her newly mended leg as she went down hard on the concrete. "We just want to ask you some questions about your boyfriend," a man sneered, his breath stale with cigarettes and beer. Her denial earned her a blow that filled her mouth with blood. They wanted her to lure Victor into an ambush, alone. "The alternative," the man said casually, "is we hurt you until you do." With her hands pinned and a gun to her head, she made the call. His voice, sharp with immediate concern, made it worse. "I need you," she whispered, her voice cracking with a fear that was all too real. "They want you to come alone." Hanging up, she felt a hollow sickness. She'd just set a trap for the only person who'd shown her true kindness in years. With the immediate danger gone, a chilling quiet settled over the alley. Victor knelt beside her, his expression a mixture of fury and relief that mirrored the storm inside her own chest. He had made it in time. But this terrifying outcome was the very thing he'd tried to prevent. The whispers, the warnings, the chilling text messages, they had all led to this moment. This was the price of his world bleeding into hers. He had promised to protect her, to make the talk stop. But the only way he knew how involved a show of force that would only confirm everyone's worst assumptions. He'd told her that in his world, anyone who threatened what was his would answer to him personally, a promise that had just been violently kept. She had feared that would make things worse. But now, huddled on the cold pavement, she understood it was the only thing that had kept her alive. The whole mess had spiraled from something that felt so disconnected from this dark alley and the cold fear gripping her. It had all started with a simple arrangement, weekly dinners, a quiet friendship. But people talk, they see what they want to see, and they had seen a struggling waitress who had somehow captured the attention of the city's most dangerous man. Some called her lucky, some foolish, but others, the ones who mattered, clearly saw her as a liability. It all happened so fast. One moment she was walking toward her car, the next, three strangers blocked her path, their faces hard and their eyes cold. One of them spoke her name, not as a question, but as a final confirmation. Lena Hayes. Instinct took over and she tried to run, but her leg, the very reason this all began, buckled after only 3 steps. The limb that had been her miracle of recovery became her anchor in a sea of terror. She had worked late, a last-minute shift change she'd forgotten to mention to her security detail. They were out front, watching the wrong door while she walked into a trap in the darkened alley. A broken backlight plunged the narrow space into near-total blackness. The men moved with a coordinated purpose that screamed this was not a random mugging. This was planned. This was personal. This was exactly what Victor had been afraid of. And she, in her desire for normalcy, had walked right into it, forgetting every single security protocol James had drilled into her. Fear, he had said, keeps you careful. But routine had made her complacent. "They won't hesitate to hurt you to get to me," Victor had warned her just 3 days earlier, his voice grim. She'd said she understood, but she hadn't, not really. Not like this. They had sat in that restaurant, the food untouched between them, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. He'd looked exhausted, worn down by the pressures of his world. He explained that rivals saw her as leverage, and even some in his own organization saw her as a sign he was going soft, that his mercy was a weakness. "In my world," he'd said, "vulnerability gets you killed." He had offered to end it all, the dinners, their strange connection, everything, for her safety. It would have been the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But she couldn't say yes. She didn't want him to walk away. Because for the first time in 10 years, he'd confessed, his voice low. I look forward to something that isn't business. It's the only time I feel like a person, instead of a weapon. And she'd admitted she didn't want to walk away either, so they agreed to keep going, but with caution. A promise that was broken the moment she forgot to mention her schedule change. That caution had begun with a text message from an unknown number, just a few words that had turned her world upside down. I'm being watched. When she told Victor, the relaxed man she shared dinner with vanished, replaced by someone cold, focused, and visibly concerned. He'd immediately put his top man, James, on it and insisted she accept a protection detail. Two men who would be her unseen shadows. I don't want bodyguards, she'd argued, but his reply was flat and final. And I don't want you dead. He told her then, his eyes holding hers, that his enemies would love to find a weakness to exploit. You're that weakness now, he stated, the words hanging between them like a death sentence. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a choice between his protection or ending their arrangement completely. Chilled by the memory of the text, she had agreed. That night, James drove her home, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors. He gave her an emergency number, stressing the seriousness of the situation. Fear keeps you careful, he'd told her. Careful keeps you alive. And for a week, she had been. The shadows were there, and she was safe. Until she wasn't. Before the direct threats and the bodyguards, there were just whispers. It was her friend Marcus at the diner who first gave them a voice. People see what they want to see, he'd said gently. And what they see is a waitress who caught the attention of the most dangerous man in the city. He'd warned her that people were talking, wondering how she could afford the best doctors, how she'd landed a table every week at the most exclusive restaurants. He told her some thought she was a liability. The idea had sent ice through her veins. She had been so consumed with the miracle of her recovery, of walking again without pain, that she never considered the outside perspective. The special treatment made no sense unless there was something more going on. Even if there wasn't, the perception was reality. Victor knew it too. When she finally brought it up, he wasn't surprised. They think you're sleeping with me, he said calmly, dismissing the rumors as irrelevant. But they weren't irrelevant to her. Her reputation mattered. Then stop associating with me, he'd offered, his voice devoid of emotion. But she couldn't. She didn't want to walk away. She just wanted it to be less complicated. And it had all started so simply. She was a waitress, sidelined by a debilitating leg injury that surgery couldn't fully fix, facing a future of chronic pain and limited mobility. He was Victor Kane, a name spoken in whispers, a man who moved in circles she couldn't imagine. He came into the diner one afternoon, a place he had no business being, and saw her limp. He saw her trying to hide the pain as she worked. After a quiet conversation where he seemed to understand everything she wasn't saying, he made an unbelievable offer. He would cover the costs for the best surgeon in the country, a specialist who could give her back her life. There was no talk of repayment, no hidden agenda she could see. All he asked for in return was that she join him for dinner once a week. Just dinner, just conversation. A simple arrangement, a strange friendship born from a moment of unexpected compassion. A single choice that saved her leg, but unknowingly, put her entire life in danger. She had become a target weeks before they ever laid a hand on her. It began with whispers. The atmosphere shifted wherever she went. Conversations would halt mid-sentence. Eyes followed her with a disturbing mix of curiosity and what looked like fear. Even Marcus, her co-worker of 3 years, became cautious around her. What is going on? She finally cornered him one slow Tuesday night. He glanced around nervously. People are talking, Lena, about you and Victor Kane. Her stomach plummeted. What are they saying? He sighed, rubbing his tired face. That you're his. The words explained everything, the stares, the silence, and why some of Victor's enemies would see her as the perfect leverage. The irony was that just as the world began to see her as his property, she had started to feel like his friend. The recovery had been brutal, 6 weeks of agonizing physical therapy. But his visits, twice a week, and his quiet belief in her, because quitting isn't in your nature, had been her anchor. 12 weeks after surgery, she took her first steps without a crutch, and for the first time in 4 years, she felt hope. When she walked into the restaurant for their weekly dinner, the pride on his face felt genuine. For a moment, it wasn't a deal with the devil, but that very connection, so visible to the world, was what had painted the target on her back. He believed in her strength for one reason, something he'd told her during a moment of doubt. "I know you stood up to me with a broken leg and no way to defend yourself. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." And in that moment, the entire story rewrote itself. It hadn't begun with his charity at all. It had begun with her defiance. The confirmation came via a sterile text message. The threat was neutralized. Safe. Lena should have felt a wave of relief wash over her in the quiet luxury of the mansion, but all she felt was a profound hollowness. The silence was broken by the arrival of a car. It was Emma, the young waitress, looking small and out of place on the grand doorstep. "Mr. Kane sent for me," she said, her eyes wide as she took in the opulent surroundings. "He thought you might need a friendly face." Lena led her inside, the girl perching nervously on a silk sofa. "I wanted to thank you," Emma said, her voice barely a whisper, "for what you did for me at the diner. I know all of this. It's because you protected me." And then she revealed something that made Lena's stomach clench. "He came to see me last week. Mr. Kane. He wanted to make sure I was okay, to offer protection. That protection was a cage, no matter how gilded." Lena remembered the conversation in his car as the sky began to lighten after the attack, the city still asleep. "This can't happen again," he'd said, his voice quiet but intense. "They came for you once. They'll be back." He told her about the house, a sanctuary miles from the city where she'd be safe until he could, in his words, eliminate the threat. "What if I say no?" she'd asked, feeling trapped. His answer was just another cage. "Then I assign a full security team, 6 men, 24/7. They'll follow you everywhere. You'll have no privacy, but you'll be alive." He finally turned to her, the look in his eyes sealing her fate. "Ending things between us won't make you less of a target, it will only make you an easier one." And a target was exactly what she had been. The memory of the alley was still sharp, a nightmare of concrete and blood. Victor had materialized at her side in an instant, slicing through the zip ties on her wrists after the chaos ended. "Are you hurt?" he'd demanded, his voice ragged. "My leg!" she'd gasped out. He swept her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. "James, handle this." Victor's voice turned to ice as he addressed his man. "The police will find 3 dead criminals who chose the wrong person. Make it look like a gang war." At the private clinic, Dr. Chen confirmed she had torn ligaments, a painful souvenir from being thrown to the ground. "You were very lucky," the doctor told her, bandaging her wrists where the ties had dug in. Victor paced the entire time, a caged beast simmering with a fury that felt more dangerous than the men he'd just had killed. "This is my fault," he'd ground out on the drive. "I underestimated them." Dawn arrived gray and cold. Lena was still in the window seat when her phone buzzed. The text from James was brutally simple. "It's done. Mr. Kane is safe. Volkov is no longer a threat." No body count, no gruesome details. Just a clean, final end to the war that had started the moment she'd thrown herself in front of a frightened girl named Emma. Lena had sat there all night, watching lightning split the sky, wondering how many men would be dead by morning. Now she knew. The world was safe again, but she was surrounded by the wreckage of a life she no longer recognized. She cried for the first time since the attack, for her brother Daniel and his foolish choices, for her mother who died thinking her son was a hero, and for the simple girl she used to be before Victor Kane turned her world upside down. Her future felt like it was slipping through her fingers with every new, terrible truth. Just the night before, he'd stood in this very kitchen and left her with an impossible choice. I should hate you, she'd whispered, her voice shaking. I should walk out of here and never look back. Victor's reply was quiet, devoid of the power he usually commanded. You should, and you can. I'll have James drive you anywhere. You'll be protected until Volkov is dealt with, and then you'll never have to see me again. He had asked her, Is that what you want? And the most painful part was the single raw word that escaped her lips. No. She'd asked for time, and he'd given it to her, pausing at the door only to say he was sorry. Not for the consequences his world demanded, but for her pain, for the years she'd struggled alone. Then he was gone, leaving to wage a war in her name. That war had a face, Marcus Vulov, a name that meant nothing to her 2 weeks ago, but now defined everything. Victor had explained it over takeout Thai as rain hammered the windows. He runs territory on the east side, Victor had said, his tone perfectly neutral. Taking you was his way of proving I'd gone soft. He'd laid out the brutal logic of his world. Weakness invites aggression. To protect her, to protect his own authority, Vulov had to be permanently removed from the equation. When Lena pushed for another way, for police, he patiently explained how Vulov owned half the department. If I don't respond decisively, he'd said, his hand covering hers, every two-bit criminal will think they can come after you to get to me. It was her protection that sealed Vulov's fate. And she needed that protection because of what Vulov's men had done. For 2 weeks, the safe house had been a beautiful prison, the gilded cage where she was forced to relive the assault. The memory was a brand on her mind, the feeling of zip ties digging into her wrists, the taste of blood and shattered teeth. Deeper than the torn ligaments in her leg was the image of Victor walking into that alley alone, a man ready to die for her. He'd kept her updated on the investigation, but every visit was a reminder of the gilded walls closing in. Her life would never be normal again. The safety he promised felt more like a sentence, and she was beginning to understand that once you entered Victor's world, leaving was never simple. The investigation into Vulov, however, had unearthed a ghost from her own past. Your brother, Daniel Hayes, Victor had said, his face a complex mask of anger and pity. He worked for me 5 years ago. The room had tilted. He explained how Daniel, her charming, reckless Daniel, had been skimming from collections, stealing nearly $200,000 before he was caught. That's not possible, Lena had choked out. He died in a construction accident. The terrible truth came out, piece by devastating piece. Daniel hadn't fallen by accident. He'd fallen 4 stories while running from Victor's men. My people were chasing him, Victor admitted, his voice tight. It wasn't an execution, Lena. It was an accident during pursuit. He had known for 2 weeks, ever since the attack, but had been afraid to tell her, afraid she'd see him as the monster everyone claimed he was. And this entire catastrophic chain of events, all the violence and loss, had started with an act of simple decency. A waitress with a mountain of medical debt and a leg that ached with every step, making a split-second decision in a diner. She saw a scared young girl named Emma being harassed by a couple of thugs. Without a thought for her own safety, Lena had stepped between them, putting herself in the path of men far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. That one act of courage put her in Victor Kane's orbit. That was it. That was how it all began. He had shown up alone, just as they'd demanded, a silhouette in a perfect suit against the grimy alley light. Let her go, he said, his voice a low command. The man holding her laughed. You don't give the orders here, Kane. That's when Victor's smile turned terrifying. You think 3 of you is enough? Suddenly, the shadows behind him detached themselves from the walls. One by one, armed men emerged, phantoms of death led by his right hand, James. The kidnapper's bravado evaporated into stark terror. Drop your weapons, James ordered calmly. You have 3 seconds. They didn't. The ensuing violence was brutally efficient. A series of deafening cracks, screams, and then a heavy silence broken only by Lena's own shattered breathing. It was all because of what happened at the diner a week before. Three men, reeking of cheap booze and entitlement, had been harassing Emma. Lena, seeing the girl's fear, had stepped between them. "Leave her alone," she'd said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The men had sneered, but after a long, tense moment, they had left. Not without a final, lingering look that promised this wasn't over. And this new reality, this fragile bridge between their worlds, was built on a single, impossible choice made only hours before. It was a decision that began to form after her friend Emma left, a visit that had lasted 3 hours and left Lena feeling slightly less adrift. Emma had come with a message from a man who said he'd offered his protection, a man who called Lena the bravest person he'd ever met. "He said you changed him," Emma had relayed, her eyes holding Lena's. "Made him care about someone else." The words echoed in Lena's mind. Emma had pushed, gently. "You love him?" The question had hung in the air, a word Lena hadn't dared to speak. How could she love a man whose empire was built on fear, a man who took lives as easily as she made coffee? "But he also saved you," Emma had reminded her. "People aren't just one thing, Lena. Maybe he's a monster, but maybe he's also a man trying to be better because of you." Love, Emma said, was always a heavy responsibility. That single conversation had given her the strength to face him when he finally returned that evening. He looked worn down by violence, shadows haunting his eyes, yet they lit up for a moment when he saw her. "We should talk," she'd said, leading him to the sitting room. A coffee table stood between them like a vast divide as a soft rain tapped against the glass. She'd started with her brother. "I've been thinking about Daniel," she began, her voice steady. "I hate what happened to him, that he died scared and alone." She took a deep breath, meeting Victor's surprised gaze. "But I don't hate you for it." She explained that she finally understood her brother had made his own dark choices. "You didn't kill him," she said, cutting through the years of pain. "It was a tragedy, but it wasn't murder." He called her generous, but she insisted it was just honesty. And with that honesty established, she pressed forward. "I need you to be completely honest with me now. Did you know about Daniel when you first helped me? Was any of it guilt?" He never broke eye contact. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I didn't know until 2 weeks ago. Everything I did because I wanted to, because I met someone who acted from courage." His unflinching honesty gave her the courage for her next question. "What happens now?" Vulov was gone, the immediate danger over. What comes next? And that, he'd said, depended entirely on her. He laid out the options with careful precision. She could walk away, protected from a distance, forever free of him and his world. Or, he'd continued, the word hanging in the air, you stay in my life fully, not as an obligation, but as someone who matters to me. He stood then, moving to the window, his back to her. I know it's not fair to ask, he said, staring into the rain-streaked darkness, admitting that being with him would always make her a target. Lena's heart had hammered against her ribs as she asked the one-word question that changed everything. Why? He turned, the mask he always wore completely gone, revealing a raw, painful vulnerability. Because somewhere between the diner and the surgeries and the Friday dinners, I fell in love with you, he confessed, and I have no idea what to do about it. The admission settled in the quiet room, a truth that could either build a bridge or destroy one. In that moment, seeing the fear in his eyes, she had crossed the room to him. I don't know if I love you, she'd answered quietly, her hand rising to touch his face. I think I might, but I'm also terrified of what my life becomes if I choose you. He offered her an out, a path to safety and simplicity, but she knew that wasn't for her anymore. I can't go back to who I was, she'd admitted. From the moment I collapsed at your feet, everything changed. She knew she wasn't ready to walk away, maybe not ever. And when he pulled her into his arms, she let herself feel safe, imagining a future built from the wreckage of their lives. He couldn't promise her safety or a normal life, only honesty, loyalty, and his protection. And love, she'd whispered, the word feeling new on her tongue. And love, he'd confirmed, his voice thick with an emotion she never thought he possessed. It was then, wrapped in his arms as the rain washed the world clean, that she made her demand. Take me home, she'd said, not to my apartment, not here, to wherever you actually live. He had hesitated, asking if she was certain. No, she replied, but I'm doing it anyway. His genuine, unguarded smile in that moment was a revelation. That night, he drove her through the glittering city to his downtown penthouse, a place of quiet taste, lined with books and art. A telescope pointed toward a sky clouded by city lights. It was the home of a man who was fundamentally alone. I don't bring people here, he said, watching her absorb his private world. Why bring me? She asked. Because I want you to see me, he answered, taking her hands. Just Victor. Looking around again, she saw it differently. Philosophy texts, thoughtful art, the hope of a telescope. She saw a man more human and far more complicated than she had ever imagined. They talked deep into the night, about the past that connected them and the uncertain future that lay ahead. He spoke of his desire to legitimize his business, to leave a different kind of legacy. I'm starting to realize empires are just kingdoms built on graves, he'd said. I want something real. When she asked what that meant, he'd touched her face. This, he'd said. Someone who sees my worst parts and doesn't run. She had fallen asleep on his couch, emotionally spent, and awoke to find him in a chair opposite her, a tablet slipping from his grasp. In the soft morning light, Lena watched this complicated, dangerous man and wondered what could possibly come next. The answer arrived 3 days later, walking through the penthouse door with James. It was an answer that shattered their fragile peace before it had even fully formed. We have a problem, James announced, his tone all business. One of Volkov's lieutenants survived. He's talking. He shot a quick glance at Lena, the meaning clear. He's telling people you went after his boss because of a personal vendetta over a woman. Victor was dismissive, but James pressed on. 3 of our largest partners want meetings. They need reassurance you're still focused, that you haven't gone soft. That single accusation hung in the air, a direct threat to the new life they had just begun to build. With a final grudging nod, Chenwei turned and walked out, his men following in disciplined silence. Torres hesitated, then gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of his head and left as well. Clav was the last, his cold eyes lingering on Lena for a moment before he too departed. The heavy metal door slammed shut, and the vast, dusty silence of the warehouse settled around Victor and Lena. She was the only thing keeping him anchored to his own humanity, and perhaps she was. His response had been to pull her close, holding on as if she were his last connection to the world. It had come after she'd finally said the words, I don't know if it's smart or safe or even sane, but I love you and I choose you, whatever that means. He'd looked at her then as if she'd performed a miracle, just moments after her first soft kiss had broken the tension between them. I am, she'd admitted, but I'm also done letting fear make my decisions. This victory hadn't been won with threats, but with a raw, undeniable truth. It was a truth Victor laid bare for them. I haven't gone soft. I've gotten strategic. There's a difference. He'd challenged them. Prove you can still make hard choices, Torres had sneered. And Victor had. He had looked each partner in the eye, his voice resonating with a power they hadn't heard before, not of a boss, but of a man with something to protect. He told them how for 10 years his empire was built on fear, a life without trust. Lena, he explained, had changed that. She reminded him that protecting someone who matters is worth more than an image of invincibility. He made it clear he would eliminate anyone who came after her, not from weakness, but because he finally knew what was worth fighting for. If that's a problem for any of you, he'd warned, his voice ablaze in the tense air, say it now. The confrontation had been immediate, their arrival a convergence of predators. Dmitry Klov, Raymond Torres and Chenwei had entered with their security details, their focus instantly locking onto Victor and Lena. So, Clav had rumbled, his gaze dismissive, this is the woman who started a war. Victor's correction was swift and cold. This is Lena Hayes, and she didn't start anything. Torres had laughed without humor, accusing him of wiping out an entire operation for a waitress, calling it emotion that makes men sloppy. But it was Lena who had silenced them. As they debated whether she was a liability, she stepped into the fray. I'm standing right here, she'd said, her voice clear and steady. If you have questions about who I am or what I mean to Victor, you could ask me directly. The sheer force of her will had stunned them into silence. She had insisted on being there, standing with him as a united front. That morning, watching him prepare from the penthouse window, she'd refused to stay behind. We've already established that nowhere is safe, she'd said, turning to face him. And if this meeting is about me, then I should be there. She knew they would try to use her, to paint her as his weakness. Then prove I'm not, she'd challenged him, straightening his tie. Show them that choosing me wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing you've ever done. Victor had grasped her hands then, holding them to his chest. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. With a small smile, she'd replied, I learned from the best. And so they had arrived an hour early, his men sweeping the building, preparing the ground for the battle to come. The decision to face them together had been sealed the night before, after James left with Victor's message for the partners. The walls had closed in on Lena then, the reality of her new life biting down hard. This is what I meant, Victor had said softly, speaking of the cost of being with him. Lena had simply walked over to him. I know, but I'm not running. Not anymore. And it was then, understanding the war he had started on her behalf, that she knew her choice was made. It had all begun with one man, Vulov, who had violated the most fundamental rule of their world. He came after what was Victor's. Victor had responded by erasing him, an act his partners saw as a weakness born of emotion, but which was, in reality, the first decision he'd ever made with his whole heart. In mind? Torres tapped his device, presented a file, and passed it to Victor. While Lena couldn't make out the screen, she saw Victor's face go grim as he absorbed the information. This is Marcus Chen's outfit, Victor stated. Your nephew. Chenwei gave a slight nod. He's been skimming and leaking intel to rivals. By our code, he's a dead man, but he's family. I'm asking you, what's the move? It was a loaded question, a clear trap. Mercy would be seen as weakness. A death sentence would paint him as a monster. No right answer existed. Victor stared at the tablet, then met Chenwei's gaze. What do you want? The directness seemed to startle Chenwei. What? He's your blood, your family. What outcome are you hoping for? If this were just business, the answer is simple. Neutralize the threat. We both know it isn't that simple. So tell me what you really want. Chenwei was quiet, carefully considering his words. I want him to stop, to learn his lesson, to be better. I just don't know if he can. Then we find out, Victor said, handing back the device. Offer him a choice. He can skip town with enough cash to start a clean life, or he can stay and try to fix the damage he's caused, earn his way back. But you make it clear there are no third chances after this. That's the business side. Giving him the choice to redeem himself? That's family. And valuing both doesn't make a man weak. Clav let out a genuine laugh. You really have changed, Kane. The man I knew would have had his head on a platter just for the principle of it. The man you knew built a kingdom on bodies, Victor said quietly. I'm trying to build something else now, something with a future. And lasting empires are built on more than just fear. They're built on loyalty, on respect, on knowing that people screw up and some of them earn a chance to make it right. And what if they mistake that mercy for weakness? Torres pushed. If others see an opportunity? Then I will remind them just how dangerous mercy can be when it's given by someone who doesn't have to. Victor answered with a razor-sharp smile. I'm not going soft. I'm being strategic. There's a difference. Anyone who forgets it will get a very painful lesson. A silent look passed between the three partners, a communication Lena couldn't decipher. At last, Chenwei offered his hand. I can get behind strategic, he said. Welcome back, Kane, the real you. Clavin Torres shook his hand as well, and the hostile energy in the room dissolved into a tense kind of agreement. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was an understanding, a recognition that Victor was different, but no less formidable. One last thing, Torres added as they prepared to depart. The girl stays with you? She does, Victor replied. Then you better keep her safe. News of this meeting will get out, and people will see her as your pressure point. They will test you through her. Let them, Victor said softly. They'll find out what Vulov did. The partners and their security teams departed, leaving the warehouse feeling vast and empty. Lena finally exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was horrifying, she admitted. That was necessary. Victor drew her in, and she felt the last of the tension leave his frame. And you were incredible. Everything I said about you making me a better man was true. I know. She rested her head against him. So what's next? Now, he said, we start living. Carefully, but together. The following weeks were a strange balancing act as Lena and Victor figured out how to have a relationship that was half in the shadows and half in the light. She officially moved into his penthouse, but kept her own place as a safety net, spending most nights with him. She returned to her job at the diner, ignoring his objections because she craved the normalcy, even with the new whispers and stares from customers. Emma was the one who finally voiced what everyone was thinking. You seem different, she commented during a quiet shift one evening. Happier. Also terrified, but happier. Can you be both? I think that's the only way to be happy when your life involves someone that dangerous. Emma expertly refilled the coffee makers. Are you afraid he'll hurt you? No. I'm afraid someone else will hurt me to get to him, or hurt him to get to me, or that this is all just too impossible to last. But you're staying, Emma observed. I'm staying, Lena confirmed with a small smile, because against all odds, he's worth it. Victor began the slow process of shifting his empire toward legitimate ventures, cutting back on the violence, and laying the groundwork for a business that could one day be completely clean. It was a slow, perilous transition. Each change exposed them to new dangers and gave rivals new openings to attack, but he was determined. I'm doing this for you, he confessed one night on the penthouse balcony, the city lights spread out below. For us. So that one day, you might not have to be scared anymore. I'll always be a little scared, Lena answered honestly. But it's okay. The fear means I know what's at stake. It means I'm not taking any of this for granted. 3 months after the warehouse meeting, Victor summoned Lena to his real office, the one in the downtown skyscraper for his legitimate businesses. She'd never been inside before. Seeing his name on the frosted glass doors felt like a dream. I need to show you something, he said, opening files on his monitor. I started working on this after the attack, after I understood just how exposed we both were. What is it? A foundation. It's funded by my legitimate companies and provides medical care and support for people who can't afford it. People like you were. People like my brother was, before he made his mistakes. Victor angled the screen toward her. I want you to be in charge. Lena stared at the screen, at the bylaws, funding plans, and mission statements. It was all real, a solid plan to transform Victor's dirty money into something that could genuinely save lives. Why me? Because you know how it feels to be ignored, to desperately need help with nowhere to turn, to be forced into impossible situations because the world let you down. Victor took her hands in his. Because you have more strength and empathy in your injured leg than most people have in their whole lives. And because I want us to build something good together, something that's about more than just money and power. This was a life-altering choice. I know. You'd have to leave the diner, spend your days running this instead of serving coffee. It would pull you deeper into my world, make you even more of a target. He paused. But it would also give you a new purpose, a way to help others just like I helped you. Lena scanned the documents again. The foundation was legitimate, well-funded, and designed to make a real impact. It was a chance to reclaim the dreams the accident had stolen from her. Yes, she said finally. I'll do it. Victor's smile was bright and completely unguarded. I was hoping you would. The foundation opened its doors 6 months later with Lena at the helm. Their very first case was a single mother whose son needed an operation she had no way to pay for, a surgery that would allow him to walk, run, and live without pain. Lena wept as she signed the approval forms. This is what it feels like, Victor said, watching her. Using power to do good, not just to control things. I had forgotten. Then remember, Lena told him. Every time you face a difficult decision, every time things get dark, remember this. Remember you can be more than just violent. He kissed her right there in the small foundation office, surrounded by the files of people needing a second chance. And for Lena, something clicked into place. The final piece of accepting who and what they were together. Not safe, not perfect, but real and trying to be better. A year after that first night in the diner, Lena and Victor stood together at the foundation's anniversary party. It was a small affair, mostly staff, volunteers, and some of the families they had assisted. Emma was there, her brother looking healthy after treatment the foundation covered. Marcus from the diner came with his wife. Even Dr. Chen was present, giving Lena a look of quiet admiration. You've changed a lot of destinies, Dr. Chen remarked, including your own. Victor changed mine first, Lena corrected. I'm just passing it on. You're doing more than that. You're creating a legacy that will outlive us all. Dr. Chen glanced over at Victor. And you've changed him. In all my years of knowing him, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. How does he look at me? She asked. Like you're the answer to a question he gave up on. Like you're home. Later that night, back on the penthouse balcony where so many of their important talks had happened, Victor turned to Lena. The city lights twinkled below, a sea of a million untold stories. I have something for you, he said, revealing a small box. Lena's heart skipped. Victor, it's not... Or maybe it is, but it's too soon. He opened it to show a single silver key. This is for a house, out of the city, far enough to vanish if we ever have to, close enough for an emergency. I bought it 6 months ago and have been turning it into a real sanctuary, a place to start over if everything here ever goes wrong. Why give this to me now? Because I need you to know that you always have an out. You can stay here with me, the foundation, the danger, the constant tightrope walk. Or, if... Lena smiled, watching the teenage girl take her first shaky steps. From her vantage point in the foundation's new state-of-the-art facility, she saw a reflection of her own past in the girl's determined face. Victor came up beside her, his hand finding hers. Remind you of anyone? He asked softly. Every single day, Lena squeezed his hand. That girl who couldn't run, she's running the show now, she grinned. Metaphorically, of course, though Dr. Chen says I'm at 94% function, which is basically perfect to me. Victor pulled her into a gentle embrace. You were always perfect, broken leg and all. Liar. Honest, he murmured, kissing her temple. Ready to go home? Always. They walked out together, her gait now smooth and sure, his hand a steady presence on her back. That easy confidence had been cemented a year after he proposed, not with a key, but with a ring and words that brought tears to her eyes. She'd said yes instantly. Their wedding was a small affair, surrounded only by those they trusted completely. Emma stood by her side as maid of honor, while James was Victor's best man. As they promised to choose each other day after day, Lena knew this was the start of something real. This life they were building was the reason she'd made the choice she did that night he offered her a way out. He'd handed her a key, a chance to start over, completely fresh. "I'll make sure you're safe," he'd promised. "I won't follow unless you ask." Lena felt the cold weight of the metal in her hand. "You'd really let me go?" she'd whispered. "I'd really let you choose," he said. "Every day. That's what love is." She had closed her fingers around that key, a tangible symbol of freedom, and then pulled him into a kiss that held the weight of everything she'd learned. Love was a dangerous, complicated thing that demanded a terrifying amount of courage. It was choosing someone, knowing exactly how they could break you. It was realizing that the bravest act wasn't running, but standing still. "I'm not going anywhere," she had said against his lips. "Not today. Not until one of us decides this isn't worth fighting for." She smiled then. "I guess we're stuck with each other." "Forever sounds terrifying and perfect," he'd replied, his forehead resting against hers. "I never thought I'd get this. Someone who knows exactly who I am, monster and man, and chooses me anyway." It was a future neither of them could have imagined, built from impossible choices and an unlikely act of mercy. It all started with an ending, or what felt like one. Lena had thought her story was over the night her body gave out, when she collapsed on the floor of a diner, her life small and broken. That wasn't an ending, though. It was the beginning of discovering her own strength, of learning that courage wasn't about being fearless, but about acting in spite of fear. It was the beginning of finding love with a man who was learning to build a legacy from something other than violence. It all began the moment she fell at Victor's feet and whispered the three words that changed everything: "I can't run." This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.